Good afternoon, everybody. Claire, David, Ian, and Michael, it is so good to see you all today. We are going to analyze the domestic and global implications of the 2020 election. Of course, we're in the unique position of analyzing an election while one of the candidates still has not accepted its results and is contesting those results in court as we speak. So perhaps we'll start there. President Trump's ongoing litigation and his sense that these election results are not final has led to a delay in the post-election process, and namely the transition process. And David, let me start with you. You've worked on 4 presidential transitions. Many of us in the national security space are intensely focused on the implications of a delay in the transition process this election cycle. How do you think this will all end? And what impact is this delay in the transition process going to have on a Biden administration?
No, thank you, Sam. That's a very, very good question. I don't think any of us knows for sure, but I'm a little more optimistic than others. There's been a lot of pessimism all through this campaign about a volatile electoral landscape. What's going to happen. There are all sorts of dark steps we can imagine. And so far, I think that overall, America has been performing better than we expected. We got this massive outturning, an avalanche of voters, and we've never seen anything like that since 1900. We worried about violence or mayhem on the streets. We haven't seen that. I think that as a general proposition, what we've seen in Mr. Biden, the president-elect, is a professionalism, not only with him, but with his team, with people like Ron Klain coming in as chief of staff. So I overall think that this transition, while we're going through some serious bumps in the road right now, will come out all right in the end, that on January 20th, Joe Biden will take the oath. I also think it's an interesting thing, Claire, Sam, that we've all assumed that the compression of time to have the transition may damage the capacity of a Biden administration to get off the ground. I think that is true, and we certainly saw that in 9/11, and the 9/11 Commission reported that after it's over. But because Biden ran this low-key, out-of-the-basement kind of campaign, he's had a lot of time to reflect on what he wants to do and what people and that sort of thing, even before the election. So I think he's a little better prepared. They do need to solve this quickly, but I do think they'll solve it quickly, and we'll get on with things I think, hopefully, with minimal damage.
And David, I personally agree with that. I think Biden has had time during the election cycle and, of course, during his 8 years in government to prepare for the presidency. I do note that you mentioned the 9/11 Commission report, and of course, this delay in the transition process does actually delay the incoming administration from finalizing the clearances and vetting process for its nominees, which could impact the national security apparatus. And of course, President-elect Biden is not currently getting the presidential daily brief. So we'll see how long that continues and whether the Biden team does choose to litigate this in court or pursue legal avenues.
Our system is already archaic. We take way too long to vet people, with too many chairs empty when the new administration start. But I do think that given the professionalism, a lot of these people have been checked out before, they've been vetted before. So all of that's going to help.
I agree with that. And, Ian, while President-elect Biden is waiting for the post-election transition process to start, he's been working the phones. The State Department is not currently facilitating his calls, and allegedly there are piles of messages from foreign leaders at the State Department that Pompeo is not giving to the president-elect while we wait for this transition process to kick off. But President-elect Biden has been talking to foreign leaders. There's been a lot of support. Talk to us about what the world is saying about the election results, what market reactions are, and what foreign leaders are going to, what key relationships are going to change when President Trump leaves office.
3 different questions.
I always give you a packed one.
The market reaction. The markets don't like the idea that you probably don't have a Democratic Senate, which means you don't get $3 trillion of stimulus. Certainly was pricing that in. Markets generally like gridlock because it means a more favorable environment on the regulatory front to big industry, big tech, finance, all the rest. But that's a fairly vanilla answer. The more interesting question, I think, is how the international community is perceiving this, how the leaders are perceiving it, what happens to U.S. leadership globally. And there are two ways I would think about that. The first is that let's keep in mind that there are a number of leaders out there that had a really good relationship with President Trump. I mean, Bolsonaro in Brazil right now, for example, is going to be in materially worse position because of Biden's orientation on climate and because of what's happening around deforestation in the Amazon. It's not going to lower Bolsonaro's popularity at home in Brazil, but they're meaningfully going to be facing significant tariff threat on Brazilian ag, for example, like other sorts of things that I think will matter. This is a bad outcome for them. I think the Saudis, a lot of the oil producers are friends in the Gulf region, for example. Remember, Trump's first trip outside the United States was to Saudi Arabia. They're clearly not happy with this outcome. Right before this all started, Sam, you were talking a little bit about the drones sales that are being pushed through right now to the UAE. They know they're not getting that, under a Biden administration. The Russians are less happy. The Hungarians, the Turks, the Philippines. I mean, you'd be surprised when you add them all up. It's a minority, but it's not an exceptional 2 or 3 countries. There are a bunch. Having said that, America's key allies around the world, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Canadians, the Mexicans, pretty much all of the major Europeans, and the UK is in a somewhat different position, again, because difficulties in getting a free trade deal. They've all been walking on eggshells when they've met with Trump. They try to pretend they have a good relationship. They don't. America First was never meant for them. And they're delighted that Biden has been elected. And the Pew polls that have shown that America's, the view of the United States has deteriorated so much around the world, that's been a very volatile poll. That'll bounce most assuredly in 6 to 12 months. But there's a very big difference, Sam, between the fact that there'll be a honeymoon and the fact that structurally the United States is in a much more constrained position to get things done. Remember that Obama, Biden were criticized for leading from behind. Remember how difficult it was for the United States to be the world leader on trade when Obama couldn't get the Trans-Pacific Partnership done. That wasn't Trump killing it. That was Obama couldn't get it done. And Biden probably couldn't get it done if he wanted to now either. So I do think that the level of institutional erosion, both of the United States domestically, which is lasting, but also globally with a Europe that is more divided, with a Russia that's in decline but is angry at the United States and blames us, a China that's becoming more powerful but is not orienting towards our political and economic values and systems. That's a world that's harder for the Americans to operate. And Biden is going to face those constraints just as Trump has.
And Ian, we'll circle back on some of these key relationships, but let me just ask you about one, and that is Mexico. And you mentioned trade. I note that AMLO, President Obrador, is one of the few leaders that did not congratulate President-elect Biden. Do you think that that's in some way linked to NAFTA 2.0 or some other trade-related issue between the United States and Mexico?
Not at all. It's linked to the fact that the Mexicans understand that the United States is vastly more powerful than they are, and we have enormous leverage over them. And they just, as I said, these leaders walk on eggshells. I mean, I don't know AMLO personally, but I knew Abe very well. He pretended to have a great relationship with Trump. Every time they actually met afterwards, he's like, what the hell was that? Right? Like just trying to manage the conversation so they don't make headlines that could hurt Japan. Like, having a conversation with Kim Jong-un, didn't even tell him about it. Right? Or, saying maybe you need to pay more for the troops that we maintain in Okinawa. I mean, AMLO faces that times 20. And the Biden advisors completely understand that his unwillingness, his reticence to do anything to upset Trump is not meant as disrespect to the Biden presidency. It doesn't move the needle on how Biden's treated or whether or not Biden becomes president in January 20th. We got to cut him some slack. I mean, Americans frequently aren't very good at putting ourselves in the position of other leaders around the world. With AMLO in particular right now, we really should.
It's about protecting himself, you're saying.
Absolutely.
Okay.
His country, sure.
And like I said, we'll come back to some of the other key relationships, in particular, perhaps the United States and Israel as well. Bibi Netanyahu and President Trump were quite close. We'll focus a little bit on the Middle East later on. Senator McCaskill, we've been talking about the presidential election, but let's also talk about the congressional races. Democrats underperformed expectations in congressional races. Do we know why, and what lessons have we learned or are we learning from how Democrats fared in the congressional races in 2020?
Well, I will confess I haven't looked as closely at the data as I need to, but my first run through it tells me that the races that we lost were in congressional districts that make majorities. And those are not bright blue or bright red places. And those are the place that the ads heralding defund the police. I believe there were at least 70 different congressional races where that ad was the most prominent ad run against Democratic congressional candidates. Clearly, that was a difficult phrase for many of these people in these suburban purple districts to overcome. Fair or unfair? I know they don't, well, many of them don't literally mean defund the police, but it is an explanation between the difference between Joe Biden's votes and some of these congressional races. America knew Joe Biden. Joe Biden was very clear that he wanted more resources for community-based police and mental health services and so forth. He was very clear that he wanted to maintain the option of private insurance in healthcare. He was very clear. And by the way, people trusted him because they'd known him a long time. A lot of these congressional candidates that were defeated were only elected 2 years ago when they defeated Republicans. So they didn't have that track record. And so when they tried to say, no, I'm not for that, the pure volume of the messaging, the negative messaging against them weighed them down. And I think if we look at it all, we will find that that, in fact, was very damaging to Nancy Pelosi's margin. She's going to hang on by her fingernails. She's going to have the majority. But the people that she needs in that majority are going to be very careful now because they see 2022 looming and they want to be careful that this doesn't happen to them because for many of them, it almost did.
And Senator, in light of the fact that we will have potentially, most likely, a large Republican majority in Congress, how do you think that's going to impact President-elect Biden's agenda on key issues like trade, for example?
Well, Joe Biden it knows how to work Congress. And by the way, as I look at his transition, if you look at the teams he has set up for each agency, I glance through the list. There is deep and broad experience on these teams. And most of these people are volunteers, but most of them have a history in that subject matter or even in those agencies. And so he's going to be well positioned to figure out what he can get across the goal line. I look for him to find some low-hanging fruit early. Perhaps it's gun safety. Perhaps it's campaign finance reform. Something where there is 65% of Americans who agree with it, and try to use that as the first shot across the bow to easily get it through the House, and then really put some Republicans that are on the ballot in the states that he won this time in 2 years, put them on the spot.
And Michael, let's turn to the Republican electorate. In the presidential and in the congressional races, what issues did Republicans vote on this election cycle? And what message should that give the incoming administration about what matters to the American people over the next 4 years?
Thanks, Sam. I think a lot of it, when you stop and break down the analysis, shows that the economy was still a main driver for a lot of that core Republican vote that Donald Trump not just relied on, but really cemented as foundational to the 72 million Americans who voted for him. That element of the economy, that element of the personal economy for individuals mattered. It just did. Even though Republicans writ large did not speak about the economy, they didn't really run on it. because of the dominance of COVID-19 and the social unrest in parts of the country. When you drilled down a little bit closer and looked at the kitchen table, who was around that kitchen table? White suburban women who, by best estimates in the exit polling, shows about 55% of them still voted for Donald Trump. It was along those economic numbers that they saw. It wasn't just about the 401k and the current status of the 401k, but what potential growth opportunity on the other side of COVID-19 they thought would be in their best interest. When you looked at the final polling going into the weekend, and there's a lot of discussion around whether or not these poll numbers were right or wrong or how close. On the question of the economy, even though Joe Biden was able to close that gap, Trump still led on the question of who would be best able to handle the economy. And that mattered to a lot of those voters when they looked at these two individuals. Yeah, there was the concern that was just touched on in some of the other areas that mattered to them along issues of socialism and things like that. But it really boiled down to whether or not they would be better off. And they thought with Donald Trump, they would be. And that really animated a lot of the vote at the grassroots level for him around the economic message. Wasn't like it was in 2018, where it was, the border issues, or as we saw in 2016, this one really did focus on the economy more than anything else.
It's really interesting. Thank you, Michael. And David, going back to you, how many presidents have you advised? I always forget the number. I know it's quite large.
Well, it started with Grover Cleveland.
Well, we'll leave it at you've advised several presidents.
Yes, 4.
If you were in the Oval Office on January 20th at 12:01 p.m., what advice would you give Biden as he assumed office?
Very important in the inaugural address to hold out an olive branch to the other side, and not just to Trump, but to his voters, and to show a respect and respect the dignity of his voters. So many of these people in the working class have felt like they are marginalized and they haven't been understood. And I think that if he's really going to bring the country together, he has to do that in a very, very public place. Beyond that, Sam, what we know from history is those first 100 days, I know we all think are symbolic because of FDR got so much done in his first 100 days, but the truth is they really do matter. It's a time when people when the voters for the first time have a chance to see you not as candidate Biden, but as President Biden. And that's a different lens you look at people through. You give them respect, but you have expectations. I think he is in a position, at least in terms of his own team, to hit the ground running and to get a lot of things done in the first 100 days. The real issue to me is, will the other side play ball? Which Mitch McConnell is going to show up when they sit down at the negotiating table? Is it the Mitch McConnell whose office was a graveyard for so many Democratic initiatives coming out of the House of Representatives? Or is it the Mitch McConnell who has a longstanding relationship and friendship with Joe Biden? I was surprised and impressed to learn that when Bo Hunter died, and at the funeral, there was one Republican senator who came. That was Mitch McConnell. That's a very different side of Mitch McConnell. If that's the man who shows up ready to make some deals, then I think we can get some big things done.
Well, and this is a question to David as well as the rest of the group. What kinds of issues could the Biden administration in the first 100 days make progress on with Mitch McConnell? I mean, what are areas, this low-hanging fruit, I think that was referenced in a previous answer, what are some specifics there?
I think the pandemic is looms larger than everything else. And we don't know when this is going to subside. Right now, we're going to be looking at a very, very steep climb, a lot more deaths. And just as Joe Biden is taking office, now, if he can get that numbers to start falling or stabilize, and he has a vaccine, and he has a program to distribute the vaccine very fairly to the American public, and their big ethical question, who gets the vaccine early?
Sam,
we're 4% of the population. How much of the vaccine do we get? So there are big questions like that I think Biden he has a chance to resolve. And I would focus there and get jobs, go from pandemic to jobs.
I agree with David. I would point out that Mitch McConnell has a problem, and so does Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, and that is there are two parties within each party right now. Yep. You have Mitch McConnell has a fractured caucus. You could see it around the effort at COVID relief right before the election. All of a sudden, anticipating Democrats taking over, Republicans have relearned the word debt and deficit, which they dropped from their vocabulary for 4 years. So, and you also have people in the caucus who are going to want to be Trump. They're going to want to be Trump. And so if Mitch McConnell moves to make a deal, some of those folks will use that opportunity to try to elevate themselves and take on McConnell, because McConnell's popularity, even within the Republican Party, is very low. It's not like he comes with a really strong hand in terms of his standing. And then Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have the same problem. They have people who very much believe that all we have to do is go further to the left, and this will solve all our electoral problems. I don't think that's realistic, but nonetheless, it's a reality. So you're going to have both of these leaders trying to keep their caucuses together. And just at COVID relief right now, we've got a $2.4 trillion package from the Democrats, and McConnell is saying $500 billion. Well, there's a long way between $500 billion and $2.4 trillion. And the question is, will they do that in old-fashioned negotiating style, or will there be lines in the sand? I can't tell at this point.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that too. I think the critical piece to the question is exactly what Claire just put on the table, because at the end of the day, it's the dynamics of the internal political machinations that is going to move on any particular piece of legislation. Now, overarching all of that, of course, is that as we approach, I believe the date is somewhere around December 15th, December 16th, the government runs out of money. So now you've got the added pressure of having to fund the government for a period in the first quarter for the new president, who's got to David's point, trying to deal with the realities of COVID-19. To Claire's point, the dynamics of we don't want to make the Republicans look good and we don't want to make the Democrats look good on a stimulus bill. And then, of course, the realities of the state legislatures, which begin to meet in January and have to close huge budget gaps that have been created by COVID-19, as we are just about to see further shutdown and slowing down of economies going into the holidays because of, guess what, an increase in COVID infections and death rates. So the Congress and the president, the incoming president, have got to figure out how to save each other, because if they don't, we will pay a dear price, not just in terms of our economics, but in terms of our life and our livelihoods going forward. It becomes harder and harder to recover if you do not begin to deal right now in an honest way. You know, to Claire's point, find that space between 500 billion and 2.4 trillion quick. Close the overarching and overhanging, budget problem that you're going to have, at least for the first or second quarter. Get us through the first half of the year so that the president and the Senate majority, whoever that happens to be, and Nancy Pelosi in the House can work on infrastructure, which I think will be a leading indicator of an ability to move both parties and both houses along with the White House, in a positive direction, along with some other opportunities that may arise. And God forbid, we have a national crisis on top of COVID or an international crisis, because as we all know, some hotheads out around the world like to test the new American president in the first 6 or 8 months of their presidency. So there's a lot here that we've got to be concerned about. And I think Claire really kind of focuses the lens a little bit more for us when she's talking about that internal politics, because that will impact everything external.
I agree with everything that's being mentioned here, but let me at least throw in one note of optimism. I mean, if you're looking at governance, of course, it's very divided. It's going to be very, very difficult. But, when we talk about Biden coming in, starting on January 20th, we should recognize that mortality from coronavirus now is 30 to 50% lower than it was 8 months ago. And that's from treatment, that's from hospitals and knowing, sort of how to recognize symptoms early, and people the same. And everyone focusing on this believes that that is going to continue. Furthermore, the news from Pfizer and the news I expect very shortly from Moderna is considerably better than anyone focusing on this disease had hoped for 2 months ago, 4 months ago. And that implies to me there's a decent chance that even if you can't get much done in stimulus, those vaccines rolling out end of first, beginning of second quarter in a large way could reflect a couple points of GDP in the United States. And if that happens, even with governance completely broken and fragmented, both inside Congress and within the two parties, Biden could look like a hero. And I just think it's worth mentioning that.
Yep.
And Ian, we've talked over the last few minutes about issues that Democrats and Republicans don't agree on.
Yeah.
One issue that Republicans and Democrats have agreed on over the last few years is the need to counter malign activity by the Chinese Communist Party. I know this is an area you've spent a lot of attention on. According to the intelligence community, China did have a preference for then Vice President Biden. How do you think a Biden administration will look to the Chinese Communist Party, and what could change in the bilateral relationship under Biden?
So the good news is that you'll have more regularity, less volatility. There's been virtually no ongoing high-level conversations between the US and China in the last 6 months of the Trump administration. I think that Biden would recreate almost immediately something that feels more like the old strategic and economic dialogue. In other words, you're going to have lots of high-level members of the bureaucracies of both governments frequently engaging with each other. And that level of information sharing doesn't mean that we're going to trust each other. It doesn't mean that confrontation doesn't become competitive anymore, but it does mean that accidents are less likely. Escalation that's inadvertent becomes less likely. I also think that specifically on climate, there is a desire for a Biden administration to work with everyone to truly become more multilateral. And China will be a piece of that, both directly, but also through the United Nations, through other international organizations. So that feels a little bit more constructive. But, when we look at the big issues out there that really are driving the US and China apart, Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, treatment of the Uyghurs, Taiwan, South China Sea, intellectual property, lack of protection, and perhaps most importantly for the global economy, the future of big data, big tech, artificial intelligence. The Biden and the Trump administrations are virtually identical in the orientations on policy. And this is an area where the two countries, the two largest economies in the world, are increasingly in direct confrontation with each other. That's not going to stop. I would argue that that is probably the most dangerous bilateral relationship that any of us have experienced really since the end of the Cold War. And President Biden takes office dealing with that directly in front of him. I have no doubt that the people around him have a lot of experience, a lot of capability, a lot of competence, and that is to be welcomed. But that doesn't make it, frankly, easy to resolve. And I worry about it. I think for me, this will be one of the top issues to be focusing on in the first 100 days.
Yeah, and when I look at the history of the Trump administration's relationship with China, we do to a certain extent have to tell a tale of two policies. We did have the State Department, Commerce Department, DOD, and others really hitting the Chinese Communist Party hard on misinformation, on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on the Uyghurs, and all those issues. The outlier oftentimes was President Trump personally. So perhaps what we could see in a Biden administration, I would imagine, is more similarity between what the president is saying, what members of his team are saying. Of course, President-elect Biden has a longstanding relationship with Xi Jinping. They've spent time together. So I agree with you on those points. Claire, going back to you and picking up on something you said earlier about really the spectrum within each party, whether it's a GOP or the Democrat Party. How far left does President-elect Biden need to go, or how far left do you think he will go policy-wise? And in terms of just cabinet appointments and political appointments, does he need to kind of check some of those boxes from the more extreme left part of the Democrat Party?
Well, our party was unified in defeating Donald Trump, and we wouldn't have defeated Donald Trump if we hadn't been unified. So he starts from that premise that we must stay unified. So he will bring in people from all parts of the party into the governing tent. But remember, he won a primary and he was the moderate. And he won that primary earlier than most people assumed our nominee would be given the nod. And he did it because the other quote unquote moderates in the race quickly coalesced around him. But he was the winner. And he will remind you, not so gently, that his positions were different than those of some of the standard bearers on the far left. So I think he will try to govern from the middle, but he will do a lot of reach out, a lot of listening. And there are many issues where there's not a dime's worth of difference between the things. I mean, when you look at climate, will he go as far as the Green New Deal on climate? I don't think he will be able to with the government that's going to be in place in terms of Congress. But will he make it a priority more so than any president in history? Absolutely. And he will give credit and he will give a nod to the left wing of the party in terms of pushing him in that direction. So some of this is managing expectations, some of it is effective communication, and some of it is making sure that some of the loudest voices are brought into the tent and amplify his message. And I think he's working very hard to do that. I've been disappointed that there's been so much back and forth between the AOC wing and the rest of the Democratic Party in the 10 days post-election. I hope some of that calms down because there's a hell of a lot more we agree on than disagree on, and we ought to focus on the stuff we agree on in the short term.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, turning it over to the GOP, where I turned on the television earlier, and I'm mindful that we're still in the throes of the 2020 election, and all I hear from both of our networks is Trump may be running in 2024. So I'm wondering, where does the Republican Party go from here? Will it continue to be aligned with Trump's narrative? Or do you see the Republican Party kind of moving on from President Trump after Biden is sworn into office?
Oh, Donald Trump is not going to allow the Republican Party to move on from him. That just is not in the cards. There's a lot of dynamics inside the GOP that is at once entertaining, but also somewhat alarming and could potentially be destructive. And from my estimate, from my time of service inside the party as a county chairman, state chairman, and of course as national chairman, what I've seen is since Reagan left the stage, since he got on the plane headed back to California in 1989, there's been this churning inside the GOP on two fronts. One is republicanism, and the other is conservatism. Reagan was able to knit the two together and into basically one package, and a lot of America bought that. But then afterwards, without that particularized knitting, it began to fray. And of course, you had the election of both Bushes. And that, was a sort of return to sort of the more patrician side of the GOP, the sort of Rockefeller Republicanism, if you will. And a lot of the angst began to ferment at the grassroots level, particularly along constitutional lines, ironically, spending and debt questions. As I saw emerge under my watch at the RNC, the Tea Party sort of crystallized a lot of that angst and that frustration. And so then you have 5 years later, Donald Trump maximize the opportunity there. So the question now becomes, what happens? Does that sort of transformation from Tea Party to Trumpism, is that a real thing? Or was it just a reality TV moment? In other words, you turn the channel and you're onto something else. Given the personality of Donald Trump, given the work that I've done with him in the past, I don't see Donald Trump just quietly going into that good night. he in his post-presidency is not going to be building homes for the homeless, nor like Jimmy Carter, nor painting pictures like former President Bush. He will be actively engaged. He will be a former president with a Twitter account, and he will still have sway and hold over a significant part of the base. You've already seen some telltale signs and movements, not just the floating of the potentiality of running for 2024. There's a lot to that we can get into that would take some time. But what are critical moments to look at is the positioning of both his son and some of his adherents, those who support him inside the administration. The fact that there's talk about moving or having Don Jr. aligned with the RNC tells you that there's going to be some continued grip there to the RNC. Yeah, I get the pat on the back and the nod to the current chairwoman, Ronna McDaniels, but that really doesn't mean anything as much as what does it mean to have Junior close by. So what does that say for those who are looking to jockey and position themselves for 2024? Good luck. Because if the president decides to play in any way, whether getting in directly or trying to be the kingmaker of his legacy, who's going to carry on his legacy into 2024, that means that traditional Republicanism versus Trumpism is going to be at logger's head. And it's going to be hard to sort of navigate into that space if Donald Trump is sort of setting the road signs, the off-ramps, the on-ramps, and is going to make for a very dynamic period. And that's particularly worrisome for those who are looking to take control of the House in 2022, and those who are looking to expand on a Senate majority, presuming that they hold the line in Georgia in the special election in January. 2022 presents unique opportunities on those two fronts. And that is something that you're going to hear a lot of questioning and wrangling about inside the RNC, particularly if Trump continues to loom large, which I suspect he will. There's a reason why the talk is on the street about his streaming network, which is what he wanted to do before he became president of the United States. That will be the platform from which he will not only try to pull the audience from Fox, as you see him going after Fox right now, but use that as the megaphone to control the narrative inside the RNC.
And David, what would you advise President Biden do if Trump does turn himself into some kind of shadow Twitter president? What would be the best posture by President Biden?
Try to ignore him as much as possible. I think that the mainstream media will move off Trump. They're not going to carry him every day with one of these rants. It's going to be a story for a while. But I think that what Biden needs to keep his eye on is the fact that we are still deeply divided. If anything, we're more divided since the election than we were going into it. We live in a world where people have very different views of what reality is. One of the things that's been disturbing to me has been the survey that came out with Morning Consult recently in the last 10 days. Among Republicans, 70% of Republicans have now concluded that this was not a free and fair election. 70% have bought into the idea this is an illegitimate election and we're going to have an illegitimate president. That only makes the difficulties of governing on Joe Biden's part even more significant. I think he has to sort of be above the fray some. He has to be the father figure who's thinking about our long-term future, whether democracy is going to survive in this country, whether we're going to thrive once again as a people. He comes out of an old politics of the Teddy Kennedy, Tip O'Neill world. That's the kind of politician he is. Can he make that the new politics? Because a lot of people sort of dismiss it. Can he be one of the people that encourages, and I think there's a real opening for him. If he's sort of a grandfather figure, an uncle figure, I think he can encourage the younger generation to get more involved in their civic life, to go beyond voting, to really step up, because I think that's the future of this country. The rest of us, the ones that are older, just need to patch things together as best we can to fix as many things we can, and then invite that younger generation onto the stage.
Sam, can I?
Yes, please, Michael, go ahead.
I think David makes a good point there, because that's something that Ronald Reagan was able to do. Ronald Reagan, coming off the heels of Vietnam and Watergate, and all of the tumult of the time in the economy. And I remember as a young man, that's what drew me into political activism, was that sense of mission and purpose and connection to the country. So I think David makes a very important point for what Joe Biden can do, particularly for this Gen Z and Gen X political environment that is much more engaged and active, very much as we saw back on the heels of the 70s. I think that's a very important point not to miss.
And just in our final few minutes, Ian and then Claire, what's the most important thing that President Biden can do, whether it be in terms of bilateral relationships or domestically? Claire, let's start with you.
Well, I think a lot of this is tone. A lot of this is, as David said, what he says and what he avoids saying, and what he embraces and what he ignores. He has got to be focused like a laser on this message of uniting this country. He did better with a lot of the voters who had given up on the quote unquote system. And this is about building back, not tearing down. Trump was all about tearing down and grievance and negativity. And Joe Biden needs to make people feel better about not just their own lives, but where we are in this country and the strengths we have. And I think if he stays on that message, meanwhile, turning the levers of government effectively and efficiently with truly some of the best people, I think he's going to not only set an agenda domestically that will work, I think he's going to have great success reuniting our alliances. I was interested in listening to Ian talk about those people around the globe that were disappointed that he won. It will be very interesting to watch how he reestablishes alliances. I mean, look at UK. I mean, you've got a Boris Johnson who is very close to Trump. You've got some really tricky trade stuff coming up with the Good Friday agreements and the Northern Ireland issue. And, you know, what happens after Brexit, and how do we keep Europe strong in terms of the alliances of the West? All of that Joe Biden knows like the back of his hand. He knows how to do this. So I'm optimistic. And I think Trump is going to be a drag, but I don't think he's going to get the attention that he so desperately needs in the coming months and years.
And Ian, last word to you. What's the most important thing Biden can do on the foreign policy stage? Is it figuring out how to counter Russia? Is it restoring U.S. credibility? What do you think?
It's very structural. It's the international piece of what the senator just said, which is, you know, we need to recognize that around the world, no one looks at the United States and says, I want my political system to look like that. My first trip ever outside the United States was to the former Soviet Union in 1986. And, you know, you'd meet these kids that were part of the so-called evil empire. And we beat them because our ideas were better, because we led by example, because they looked at America and they said, that is the kind of place I wish my country ran like that. You might say that about Canada or Germany or the Nordics or Japan. No one would say that about the United States. And this process of institutional erosion and delegitimization has accelerated under Trump, but it didn't start with him. It's much deeper than that. It's about the media. It's about social media. It's about the role of money and special interests capturing the regulatory process. It's about the deep divisions inside the legislature. It's about the lack of ability to constrain the executive. This guy was impeached. We had 2 presidential debates. The word impeachment was not mentioned. I mean, the United States is an incredibly powerful country. People all over the world still want to bet on our markets. They still want to send their kids to our universities. I mean, there's still so much power in the United States, but the power to persuade, the power to cohere, the power to make people believe, we've lost a lot of that in decades now. And Biden needs to begin the long, slow, hard road to rebuild it. That is the biggest thing he can do.
And just final thought for me, I agree. I don't think it is going to be an instantaneous feat, despite what I understand to be President-elect Biden's best intentions. You know, from my end, I think one of the most important things that he can do is rebuild an informed and analytic process within the federal government. I think that the intelligence community, our diplomatic corps, and others have so atrophied over the last 4 years that we don't have an informed, smooth policy process at this point. So I'm looking forward to seeing the next administration move forward on all of these fronts. And I'm sure that in 6 months, we can have an incredibly timely conversation about what actually occurred in the first 100 days or so of the Biden administration. Ian, David, Michael, and Claire, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Sam. Did a
Thank
great
you.
job.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
Take care, everybody. Bye.